neighbor Ross.
I like that shirt.
Ready to see it?
Thank you.
I can't figure out
Rest of
what it looks
them.
like.
So she'll,
John,
Jamie, she would, they just have a team.
I don't know what that is. Who's that?
It's about,
Yeah.
a used fee.
So they've been-
No.
Her real first love is singing. And you know, it's really
I'm good.
picked up. Volleyball, and she's got some natural abilities.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, one natural ability she doesn't have is height.
Oh,
But you know, mine, it's like,
I was gonna say,
she got a,
gosh, we don't want to play, but are you?
I mean, that's a possibility.
How you doing?
We went to
I used to use that. Yeah.
I'm living another day.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've been shooting birds.
Oh, really? Oh. What?
I've been shooting birds on the can. CANON.
Joining you more than
My hummingbird training on Lantana like crazy.
You know, it's still cold this time. It's huge.
I put in 3. I found perennials. I got them at the garden center on Poplar Pike.
Now, we have a very yellow
Red.
So,
So all I'm gonna do in late fall is put them back, like, pine straw mulch over.
You think they'll come back?
Oh, they just have to breathe.
Oh, it's in my perennials?
Huh?
They are perennials?
They are perennials.
Ah.
They grow fast anyway.
Yeah, they do.
I put in, I got two after that. That were annual. And they are good. I've got, numerous species of butterflies.
Are you? Are you good? Who good? How about you?
I didn't get any. I didn't get any of that.
I don't know, but you know, it's Brother Hartwell, somebody comes from Georgia.
He is from Nacogdoches, Texas.
Yep. Good.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where he lives right now.
Yay.
Back to the neck.
Good.
Good. Seen that Boston?
Yeah, that's where my that's where my dad graduated from.
You already know it.
I got bored. Yeah, I was born, and 2 months after I was down in Florida.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
They moved.
Yeah. I mean, it took me 5 years ago. They moved in a BC9.
What's the BC9?
It's one of those, old, Tobro Cross. So,
Harry Taylor,
so,
That's what you were doing. Yeah. Okay, loaded up the plane and off they went, huh? Yeah. Yeah, that's quite a story. Some of them will be good. Yeah, you're making.
It's Wednesday.
Yeah, I know, right.
All
right,
I
well,
like that.
I
I like that.
Time to begin. Go ahead and get started. Take your Bible out and open to Isaiah. Hello. Does anyone need a workbook? All right. If you lose your workbook, not that anybody loses their workbook, but there's extra right here. So we have been looking at the first 12 chapters of Isaiah, talking about the judgment of God's people. And we're going to pick up tonight in chapter 10. We kind of skimmed through here at the end on Sunday morning. I wanted to start here in chapter 10. And we've just been noticing this back and forth that is given in these chapters, where in one section we're talking about doom and gloom, and the next section there's something hopeful that's happening. And so it can kind of give you whiplash, trying to keep up. And but hopefully, maybe we can kind of appreciate the complexity of prophecy. And that's one of the things I wanted to try to bring out, that there's more to prophecy than just connecting the dots. And we've noticed how God has used prophecy in an unusual way, particularly in dealing with Ahaz and the sign that he would be given. But anyhow, in chapter 10 begins with it's the conclusion of I think there was four or five oracles that start back at the end, in the middle of chapter 9. These decrees of judgment. And I highlighted each of the oracles ends with the phrase, if you look at verse 4 of chapter 10, each of the oracles ends with the phrase, it says, for all this his anger has not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. We talked a little bit about that phrase, that it's there's two competing ideas that are presented. The first being his anger is not turned away. So something bad, that's this judgment is coming, and there's nothing that they can do to stop that. It's going to happen. And the other idea is his hand is stretched out still. That doesn't sound like judgment. That sounds like something good and positive. And so we see God he's working through all of this, that punishment's coming, but there's still going to be a blessing. Another way to think about those two competing ideas also, I think, can be seen in God talking about Assyria. He describes Assyria in this chapter as the rod of his anger. So the rod of his anger fits this idea that his anger is not turned away. He's going to use Assyria as the rod of his anger to administer punishment. But his hand is stretched out still. What is he going to use to demonstrate his hand still being stretched out? You got the rod of his anger, and then how is the Messiah described? How is the Messiah described? There's a particular... No? There's a particular illustration that's been used in these opening chapters.
Wonderful Counselor?
No? I mean, he's described that way. A branch. Yeah, a branch, a shoot. So you've got the rod of his anger, and then you've got, well, how is his hand still stretched out? Well, it's going to be extended with this shoot, this branch that's going to come in the future. So anyhow, I thought those might be some helpful connections, because we've said that we can see the sort of the end point of his punishment. There's going to be an invasion and a captivity. But as far as his hand being stretched out and a renewal, the renewal is a little more complex, right? The renewal is not just about some people coming back and rebuilding a city. It's much bigger than that. And so we'll get into more of that tonight. So beginning in verse 5 of chapter 10, we start seeing judgment pronounced against Assyria. Now, in the next section that we're going to talk about, 13 to 27, I think, deals with the judgment of the nations. And so it's kind of, we're kind of getting into that kind of dynamic here in the 10th chapter. But he pronounces judgment against Assyria. That God's going to use Assyria, but God's also going to hold Assyria accountable for their idolatry, for their wickedness. And he's the central problem, of course, is the problem of pride. Who else has that problem? And that's not the first time we've seen that dealt with in the prophecy.
Judah and Israel.
Yeah, Judah and Israel. Okay, yeah. So, and this is going to be restated. This is going to be restated later in the New Testament, where Israel thought they were God's favored nation, and if you think you're God's favored nation, then you can do no wrong. Only you can. And so there was always this sense of pride and entitlement that they had. And the point that is made, that will be made much later by Paul in Romans, is that no, Israel's no better off than the nations, than the Gentiles. They both have failed miserably in obeying God, and pride is always this driving force of that disobedience. So you get a sense of his pride, and it's not very surprising. In verse 12 it says, "When the Lord has finished all his work on Mount Zion and Jerusalem, he will punish the speech of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria, and the boastful look in his eyes. For he says," this is with the king of Assyria, here's what he's saying, "By the strength of my hand I've done it, and by my wisdom, for I have understanding. I remove the boundaries of peoples and plunder their treasures like a bull. I bring down those who sit on thrones." He's very self-reliant in his perspective. And that's not hard for us to relate to, is it? This is common to how humans think when they've accomplished something. Look what I've done. Look what I've done. And so, God is going to humble him, and God is quite capable of doing that. So
Kind of the same thing that Nebuchadnezzar did.
Sure. I mean, that's a classic example of it.
If he was humble.
Yes, he was.
Perhaps in a different way.
Yes, but humbled nonetheless. And so, you could read something like this, and you could say, he's a king, and that's sort of how powerful people think. People who have very little power can think the same way. And so when you read a text like this, you need to try to relate to it, and to appreciate that this is how humans tend to think. Pride is a powerful force that can ruin us, whether we're great or small. Now as we come to verse 20 to, I guess about 27, introduces the idea of a remnant being returned. It says, "In the day that the remnant of Israel and the survivors of the house of Jacob will no more lean on him who struck them, but will lean on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. A remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. For through your people Israel, though your people Israel be as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will return. Destruction is decreed, overflowing with righteousness. For the Lord God of hosts will make a full end, as decreed, in the midst of the earth. Therefore, thus says the Lord God of hosts, O my people who dwell in Zion, be not afraid of the Assyrians when they strike with the rod and lift up their staff against you, as the Egyptians did. For in a very little while my fury will come to an end, and my anger will be directed to their destruction. And the Lord of hosts will wield against them a whip, as when he struck Midian and the rock of Oreb. And his staff will be over the sea, and he will lift up as he did in Egypt. And in the day his burden will depart from his shoulder, and his yoke from your neck, and your yoke will be broken because of that. So there's a couple things that we'll notice here in this paragraph. Number one, I think this is really important the way it's stated. He says that he talks about this remnant, the survivors of the house of Jacob, who will no more lean on him who struck them, but will lean on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel in truth. What is that about? Who were they leaning on? Assyria. What does it mean they were leaning on them?
They were told to go there and make their lives, and Assyria too.
They were making covenants with them, making agreements with them, so they could try to get out from under their potential destruction.
Yeah. They were. I mean, this goes back to Ahaz. They're trying to make alliances with Israel. And after all, I mean, that's what you're supposed to do as king, right? You try to solve problems and make nice with the superpower. And the problem is that, well, they have misplaced their trust. I mean, we see this coming out, and that's what he's getting at. He's saying, though, that after this, when this is all over, and the remnant returns, they will have learned the lesson. They will have learned the lesson that they are not to trust anyone other than the Lord, and so that's what needs to be taken away from all of this. So, why do you think in verses 24 to 27? Why do you think that this is stated that? Well, don't be afraid. Eventually the Assyrians are going to strike, but I'm going to punish them, and I'm going to bring you back. That doesn't seem like much comfort to me. Why do you think that's being stated? I mean, would you feel comforted by that if you knew that the superpower was going to come and turn your life upside down? But hey, eventually it's going to be okay. It's all going to work out, and you get to come back.
It would be helpful to have a timeline if that was a few of those people.
Okay.
When,
Okay, that would be helpful. Why else? I think that's part of it.
It's part of the big picture. The big picture is that God is in control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, part of the big picture. When they have these, this captivity is cataclysmic to these people, and eventually, when they get the survivors get through that, they're going to have time to try to make sense of all of it, and they're going to realize why this happened. I mean, they're not at a point where they're even willing to listen to anything Isaiah has to say. That's why we've said that this prophecy is, yes, judgment is coming. You need to repent, but you're not going to, and you're going to get punished anyway. But eventually, they're going to, as he points out, they're going to learn. And in part of that process, no doubt, would have been, there was this guy named Isaiah who talked about all this kind of stuff. And maybe we need to go back and read what he wrote. And so a section like this, it spells it out, and that's kind of why, one of the big reasons why Isaiah is given credibility, even to this day, right? When prophecies are fulfilled, it's you can make these connections, and well, he said this was going to happen. You point out about this. There's a timeline that's given, and that's very specific, and that's going to become important to them later on. But of course, it can come across as like, well, that's not much comfort to the people who are going to be punished. But when you're on the other side of it, you're going to come to appreciate this prophecy about a remnant. I mean, this is central, right, to what Isaiah has to say about the future, about a remnant. There's survivors, and something good is going to come from this remnant. So it's promised here that they'll get to come back eventually.
David, do you think it's anything like in the New Testament for us where we're told we'll be persecuted and everything, and we're going to have trials and all that, and, you know?
Yeah, it's different. It's different, but I mean, there's some similarities there, I suppose.
I mean, I just think, you know, it's going to be hard, but we have to look at the future, just like they had to look at the, I mean, because they weren't coming back, the people he's talking about. They were going to be in captivity too long.
Yeah.
So these people were never coming back, were they?
Right. Anything else?
Well, I think God's providence sometimes is a very long time span that is very difficult for us as humans. And when a month seems like a long time, or a few months, or 6 months, and God's providence is years. And sometimes we're trying to teach or be an example or deal with a family member, then sometimes you have to take a longer term view.
Yeah.
But God's providence is not as quick as we want it to be.
Yeah, and I what do we know about what is happening and what's going on? I mean, that's one of the big points that is made in Job, right? God tells Job basically, you can't begin to understand the complexities of ruling the universe justly. We like as humans, we don't have the capacity to even begin to understand that. And that's just, that's essentially the answer that he's given. So yeah, you see there's a lot at work here, and but eventually it's going to come together, and there's even more that is yet to come together.
Which is the main thing to see that they have to trust.
Trust.
in God.
That's what he says. They'll learn not to lean on the ones that they were, but to lean on the Lord.
Even all this bad stuff, which is, yes, all the bad stuff they've been doing and what's going to happen, but you still have to trust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Job was being persecuted or having huge trials all along the way that she brought Job up. So that makes it even tougher, or more of a test of faith.
Yeah, Job seems to trust. It's just he wanted to question it and see why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't think he ever lost his trust, because he trusted that he was to the end.
Yeah. It's very difficult to trust, and with Ahaz, Ahaz had reason to be afraid. This was the third time he was getting ready to be invaded, and he's trying to prevent that from happening. But when God tells him, hey, it'll be all right, and he doesn't believe it. Okay. Chapter 11. Chapter 11 returns to the idea of the branch. In verse 1 it says, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. It is interesting, I guess, if you read the end of 10, where the prophecy is talking about God cutting down the thickets of the forest with an axe, and Lebanon will fall by the majestic one, and you're chopping the forest down, and then chapter 11 begins with this idea of this shoot is going to come up. And we've already seen this, but it returns to the idea. It mentions the stump of Jesse. It's of course we recognize a royal family here, and a royal family that had been long cut down, and it's going to reemerge. And the reign of the branch is described in this next section, and it describes really the justice of how he rules. He's going to be just in his decisions, and the peace that's going to follow when he emerges on the throne. Verse 2, it says, "The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, and the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what he hears, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be in the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins." Now, he certainly is. There are some really inviting ideas behind what's expressed here. Someone who is going to be peaceful is certainly attractive, but there is also an element of awe and reverence that we should have in thinking about how he's described here. Especially in what is said at the end of verse 4, that he'll strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. I mean, this is describing the branch. This is describing the child that was promised in chapter 9 and back in chapter 7. And so there's these different images that we have of the Messiah, and we seem to gravitate towards sort of the meek and mild characteristics of the Messiah. When you're talking about a king, you're talking about someone who's of reverence and submission, and so we need to be balanced. I would suggest in the way we view the Messiah, the way we view Jesus. Then he goes on to describe the peace that will follow, and I think these are some familiar phrases to you. We'll see these again in Isaiah. In chapter 6, it says, "The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf of the lion and the fatted calf together, and a little child shall lead them. And the cow and bear shall graze, and their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. Then they shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain." And then one of the classic lines out of Isaiah, "For the earth shall be full of knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." I just love that expression. The knowledge of the Lord covers the earth as the waters cover the sea. You think, the waters cover the sea? What does that mean? That aren't the waters the sea the waters? And you think of what water does. When water fills up a space, it fills it up fully, completely, entirely, right?
All the way.
All the way. All the way. So it's, again, you're trying to put into language what's the greatness of what's coming. And how do you do that? How do you do that? Well, this is what Isaiah has written here, as the waters cover the sea. So it's perhaps chapter 11 here is more encouraging than what we said about the end of chapter 10. In verse 10, though, there's more description about this branch, and there's some more descriptions that are given that we find elsewhere. We find elsewhere in the Bible that help us help us understand how this is going to be fulfilled, how it all comes together. In verse 10, it says, "In that day, the root of Jesse, who shall stand as a signal for the peoples, of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious." So, the root of Jesse here, this branch, is described as a signal or an ensign. A banner that would be raised up in battle to signal what was happening. People would rally around that banner. Another old song that we used to sing, "Sound the Battle Cry." It's a great old song that as kids we loved to sing. Maybe we'll sing it tonight. We sang the old song I mentioned last Wednesday night, which was kind of neat, but sound the battle cry, yeah. Raise the standard high for the Lord. It comes out of, this illustration here. So, the signal, though, one of the things that is important to notice is, and it can be easily missed, who's the signal for in verse 10?
Is it for the Gentiles?
Okay, yeah.
I don't quite understand. I had a note here, and I was gonna ask you to understand how we get the Gentiles from that.
That's a good question. That's a good question. We'll try to answer that. Anytime you see the word peoples, that's always a reference to the Gentiles, the nations, the Gentiles. And we're gonna talk more about them. But in Romans, Paul deals with this. In Romans chapter 9 to 11, I don't know when the last time it was you read Romans 9 to 11. It's really complex and challenging to understand what he's trying to describe. In those chapters, he's explaining how the Messiah was going to bring the Jews and the Gentiles into God's family together. How do you do that? You wonder, like, Jesus told them that they were to go to the Jews first and then to the Greeks. You say, well, what's that about? Why not just go to everybody at once? But Paul starts to unpack that in some of what he says. But Paul, let me turn over there in, I think it's chapter 11. Really, in chapter, we'll look at chapter 15. Chapter 15 is sort of the summation of the whole book, because he's just explaining to you how Christ fulfilled everything that was promised by God to Abraham in bringing in the Jews and the Gentiles. In verse 8 of Romans 15, it says, "For I tell you that Christ became a servant to the circumcised to show God's truthfulness, in order to confirm the promises given to the patriarchs, and in order that the Gentiles might glorify God for His mercy." He says this is why Christ came. This is what He came to accomplish, to be a servant to the circumcised, to Israel, and also to bring the Gentiles in. And then he says, "As it is written, therefore I will praise you among the Gentiles to sing your name." And again it said, "Rejoice, O Gentiles, with His people." And again, "Praise the Lord, you Gentiles," and all the people extol Him. And again, Isaiah says, "The root of Jesse will come, and He will arise to rule over the Gentiles. In Him will the Gentiles hope." So, the language is interesting. The idea of Him, He arises to rule. They're raising this. They're raising a standard. Jesus said that if I'm lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men to myself. When we think of the standard it's the cross. Christ is raised up from the earth, suspended between heaven and earth. And the signal, the ensign, is the cross. And it's through faith in what God accomplished by Jesus at the cross that brings the Gentiles and the Jews together. I think Kurt read from Ephesians 2 last Wednesday, where Christ is our peace. Through His blood, we're brought nigh, brought near by the blood of His cross. And that's all wrapped up in what Isaiah is saying here. Now, if when Isaiah says that, not even Isaiah knows that. That explanation there's much to be done before that explanation can be given. In chapter 11 of Isaiah, though, in verse 11, it says, "In that day the Lord will extend His hand yet a second time to recover the remnant that remains of His people, from Assyria, from Egypt, from Parthos, and Cush, and Elam, and Shinar, and Hamath, from the coastlands of the sea. He will raise a signal for the nations, and will assemble the banished of Israel, and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth." So it introduces that there's again, I keep saying it, there's more to a remnant returning than just people coming back to rebuild the city. That what's going to happen here is is something bigger than any one of them would have ever been able to envision at the time. But it's, again, it's through the cross. This is fulfilled through the cross. The remnant, the way Paul explains the remnant, what is the remnant? Who are the people of the remnant? He says, well, it's not a remnant that's by birth. It's not according to the law. He says it's a remnant of, you remember? It's a remnant of grace. It's a remnant of grace. That's what he says in Romans 11:5. And so faith in God's grace. Well, what's God's grace? Well, God's grace is the gift of the Son of the cross. Through faith in God's grace, then you are adopted into the remnant, into this remnant family. And that's what matters. And that's where Paul starts in Romans, right? He tells you what the gospel is in those opening lines, and then says that, well, everybody can be saved who believes that. So,
In Romans 11, Paul continues that analogy of grafting the Gentiles into the vine or the root. So he carries sort of this same idea forward and says, this is how it's going to happen. There were some branches that were broken off, and there are going to be other branches grafted in, and those are the Gentiles. That's how they got it.
yeah. He uses that illustration there in 11, and 9 to 11 that's what he explains in those chapters, and it's so that why is the gospel preached to the Gentiles? Paul says, well, it's to make the Jews jealous, to provoke them. That if all of these blessings are offered to the Gentiles, we don't want to miss out on it, so we'll come back. And he says that's how he tries to bring them back. The goal being that with one voice, he says in chapter 50, with one voice, we would glorify God together. That is basic and fundamental to the purposes of God. He wants the human family to glorify Him with one voice, and that is able to happen through faith in the cross. The branch, the signal, the ensign. He's going to raise a signal in this chapter. He says, for Israel and the nations. For Israel and the nations. Anything else you want to mention about chapter 11? Chapter 11 is significant because of the way it is later used to explain the big picture.
How does your verse 12 read? He will set up a banner for the nations and will assemble the outcasts of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
That's what New King James.
Okay, yeah, the banished is what ESV says, and the dispersed of Judah. So it's
Those are dispersed people.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what about, 6 through 8, a lot of people in the premillennialists believe that, everybody's gonna be at peace on earth. But when he talks about the wolf and the lamb and the viper and the cow and the bear, so do you think he's talking about the nations versus God's people? Or why is that illustration of those different examples?
Well, those different examples, those are things that are at odds with one another.
So who does that represent, I guess?
Yeah, I think he's trying to describe the peace that he's bringing, and those are the I think that's the symbolism of what he's saying. That if the wolf and the lamb, well, that's the prey and predator.
Everything's gonna change, and it's not gonna be like anything you've ever seen.
Yeah, and we're gonna we'll see that later in the second section of the book, where he's describing God's new world, his new creation, and it's going to be united. It's going to be peaceful. It's the complete opposite of everything that we have come to know and experience in the old world.
I kind of read it as what it would look like in God's kingdom one day. Because, typically those things are in odds with one another. In what world does the wolf dwell with the lamb? And so, to me, it's just an imagery of what the kingdom will be like.
Yeah, I think so. Hosea.
Two.
Yes, yes, same thing. Hosea is contemporary with Isaiah. I think we said that earlier in, Hosea may very well be borrowing from Isaiah, just for whatever that's worth. Chapter 12. I describe chapter 12 as an epilogue for the first 11 chapters. So, I try to find the flow of thought when I'm studying a book. If you can find the flow, if you can find the dynamic, then you can see what's developing. It's sort of the bird's eye view of the first 11 chapters, where we see this idea of punishment and hope. It goes back and forth throughout the whole thing. But it culminates in chapter 11. Chapter 11 is not, it's dealing with something really big, overwhelmingly positive, that God is going to bring about through the remnant, through the branch. And so Israel, we're to the point in chapter 12, it's like a psalm, essentially. And we've said how in Isaiah there are psalms that are used, songs that are used. This is much better song than chapter 5, where 6 woes are given. But or the vineyard song of chapter 5. You remember, I made a vineyard. I did everything to make my vineyard grow, but it didn't grow. And it's a song. It's just a really depressing dirge. Chapter 12 though is completely different. He says, "You will say in that day." So again, we're going back to what is culminated in chapter 11. "I will give thanks to you, O Lord, for though you were angry with me, your anger turned away." You think about that phrase, the anger of his hand is not turned away, his hand is stretched out still. Here's how things are going to be completed. "Your anger turned away, that you might comfort me. Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and will not be afraid. For the Lord God, my strength, is my song, and he will become my salvation. With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. You will say in that day, give thanks to the Lord. Call on his name. Make known his deeds among the peoples. Proclaim that his name is exalted." There's another song that we sing. "Sing praises to the Lord, for he has done gloriously. Let this be made known in all the earth. Shout and sing for joy, O inhabitants of Zion, for great is your midst, for great in your midst is the Holy One of Israel." So here we go, going back to the remnant being introduced in 11. You've learned the lesson. You've learned not to lean on the kings, the nations. You've learned to trust in the Lord. There's a key verse about faith that we didn't touch on back in chapter 7, verse 9. At the end of that verse, it says, "If you're not firm in faith, you'll not be firm at all." And here you get people who are firm in faith, and they recognize what God has done for them through the branch. It's brought them comfort. Chapter 40, that's the opening lines of that hopeful text. "Comfort you, my people." And comfort is brought through Emmanuel. God is my salvation. I will trust and will not be afraid. That's the opposite of the condition of the people at this point. They don't trust, and they're scared to death. They're scared to death about what's going on in surrounding nations. You will, with joy, you will draw water from the wells of salvation. That kind of connects back to things, to some of the wells and springs that they had that were referenced earlier in the text. But they're praising that the last line here in verse 6: "Shout and sing for joy, O inhabitants of Zion, for great in your midst is the Holy One of Israel." They're praising God. The Creator is the Holy One of Israel. That's how he is mainly, or most frequently identified in the text. So they celebrate the culmination of God saving the world through the branch. It's a great passage. We won't read it, but you can look at the last paragraph in Romans 11, where Paul kind of wraps things up about how God was faithful through Christ, and he essentially writes the same thing, like a psalmist there. We've got a couple minutes. We'll just do a little 1 to 12, Isaiah 1 to 12 wrap up. A couple points here. So in summary, just to remember where we were, where we've been, so we know where we're going. Judah's become idolatrous. That's chapter 1, producing immorality and injustice. They are corrupt from head to toe, is how Isaiah describes it. They've misplaced their trust. We've already talked about that. That is the fundamental problem. They've misplaced their trust. While they will be punished, God is not finished with them. It bears repeating that Israelites, they knew they were living in a story that had yet to be completed. That's what they're going to come to realize on the other side of it. God's not finished with them. Through their nation, a child would come to bless and rule all nations. So there's, you can understand why they would be thinking in political terms. I mean, how else would you? What else would you think the Messiah was going to do? This is why what he does is so surprising to them. So that's just a brief summary of the first 12 chapters. Very brief. So when you if you can keep sort of these bullet points in mind, then you can read through the details of that section, hopefully without getting lost.
God is not finished with them, not because of their value, but because of his promise of his covenant, with all the way back to Abraham. That's why he's preserving that.
Yep.
That's where the Messiah is going to come through that line. So that's not them deserving that.
That is with the resurrected Lord, put it that way. The resurrected Lord affirming that all power is given to me in heaven and on earth. He is over all. And so we're obligated completely to him. We're out of time.
How far do you want it to go for next week?
You can read that. You can just start reading that whole middle section. I'm going to give a little introduction about the nation. So 13 to, I think it's 13. We probably won't get beyond 15. I'll put it that way. Does that help? 13 to 15.
You want some for your family?
Oh.
Are you glad to see them?
Oh,
come
on.
She's mad at me. I beat her up on Monday.
Soon.
Sorry. So, I do the book too, so that's, we've been out of town, so I got a lot of.
Catch up on.
Yeah. Because I did everything after the night, according to my scheduling. But, it wasn't. It's not behind. Because the book is helpful.
It is.
And since I paid for them, I feel like I should use them.